Hi, my name is Kendra. This is Andrew. We're going to be talking a little bit about the history and design of the Common Core State Standards. We haven't always had Common Core State Standards. I know when we were in school, there were California Content Standards, I believe they were called. A lot of memorization, a lot of tests, a lot of things like that, that they basically decided were not preparing us for the real world as much as they want us to. Okay, so the Common Core State Standards, the talk of the new standards was in about 2007, where they kind of started to review some of the things that were wrong, I guess you could say, with the standards that were in place, and the fact that none of the states were really following the same guidelines. Not that it probably happened too often, but more than we'd probably think, is that people were coming from one state to another state, like moving or something, and they hadn't been taught the same content up to that point. Like, let's say like a fourth grader maybe was higher in one state than in another. And it kind of became a problem when we got to like college, when we had kids who were competing to go to colleges in a different state from other states, or maybe one from their home state, and their competition either knew more than they did or didn't know as much as they did, or weren't as prepared for college as the others. So what they decided is that probably around 2007, they wanted to get everybody on board for the same thing. So then they started talking about who was going to be involved, what it was going to look like, but then more towards like 2008, it was a long process because we didn't even end up implementing them until about 2013. But so they wanted to upgrade them. They basically knew that they didn't like them and they wanted to upgrade them. So then in 2009, they made their first draft where they looked at what they liked from the old standards and kind of embellished them to make them better or fit more of the real world needs that they were seeing that didn't exist prior to that. So then in about, or after 2009, or in the year of 2009, they had groups of people kind of review them, or especially educators. Teachers played a really large role in it because teachers were able to see, if that was something that they thought would make their student achievement go up. Because all of this is kind of based around students being able to achieve more or being better for when they get out of school, more prepared. So then about 2010, they revised the draft they originally had because they found some flaws in it, and like the state governors and just the teachers and people who were they were experts in the different content areas. After they kind of looked at it, used some of it with some study groups and things like that, they revised it. After that, a couple of years went by of just review. No one was kind of jumping up and down to implement them quite yet because they felt like they still needed to go through with them with like a fine-tooth comb. And so it probably wasn't until 2013 that a lot of the states, 45 of them, started out implementing them or using them in their classrooms, and then it actually got progressively smaller with the amount of states that were using them. But we went from about 2013 was about 45, 2014 was about 43, 2015 was 42, and then now we have about 41 states who use it. So that is kind of a little bit about how they started and the history of it, and then like the design of it. But I think a really important part of why we've switched to Common Core State Standards is that we were seeing that kids were not able to actually apply the things that they were learning in their lives. Almost like just they would learn a bunch of things and then memory dump them because they didn't require any kind of like skill or anything. It was just purely content. Like, can you name all 50 states? It wasn't anything that asked them to explain why things were the way they were or justify how they got an answer or any type of reasoning that went along with it. Okay, so that's the Common Core State Standards. Throughout this course, we've been reading learning targets, which is great, and I've loved every single thing that I've read, really. But prior to this, we had done a video from chapters, I think, like 1 to 4, So just recapping on those, learning targets are essentially the standards, but broken down to really decide what it is that we are teaching or what it is we want our students to do. And so like the creation of those, you have to use the standard to do so. Like you have to look to your standard, but the learning target should be your main focus and should really be what everything in your classroom is geared towards. So designing a learning target, something that I really liked about it was that it needs to be kid friendly, because the standards are not kid friendly. As much as the standards are much better now, they are more student driven. They don't exactly say it super explicitly in a way that a kid would understand what's even being asked of them. So it's kind of the job of like making a learning target is making sure it still fits that standard, but that the kids have a better understanding, because it's kid-friendly language, of what's being expected of them and what they're going to be doing during that lesson. So that was kind of designing them. Then later we learned about assessments. Going along with the Common Core State Standards, students need to be more aware of their own learning. They need to be in charge of their own learning. They need to be able to assess themselves, like where am I going, and what do I need to do to get there. So that should be something that a student should be able to do, pretty much based off of the appropriate learning targets. If your learning target is correctly stated, it will help the kids know what it is that they're accomplishing, where they're at, and then where they're going to be going with it further, maybe in the unit, or if it's the end of the unit, what's going to be expected of them on like a summative assessment and things like that. Assessments really do drive our instruction, because the assessment is going to show, is the indicator of whether the students learned what we wanted them to do, or that they're able to use the skill that we had taught them to do, or the strategy, or anything along those lines. Your assessment is going to be what shows you where they're at in that. And that will help you move forward in a lot of things, and that's why like a lot of formative assessments, that's the purpose of them, because you use them periodically throughout your lesson or throughout your unit to see if you can move forward, or if you need to go back and reteach, or you know, if you've given them everything they need up to that point in order to be successful. And so assessments, a lot about assessments, both formative and summative, which we a little bit later we'll talk about them, because we did our own unit study for the course and had to come up with formative assessments and summative assessments that fit our learning target that we created. So assessments are great for the teachers and for the students, because it keeps us kind of on track too, because we might veer away from what's actually going to be taught, or not taught, I'm sorry, what's going to be assessed of the student. We might teach something else, and that's the assessment and also the learning target is supposed to really help with that, to where we stay focused and we make sure that what we're doing serves a purpose towards those things. So that was kind of what we talked about so far. What we haven't gone over is starting with chapter 5, that I mentioned this earlier, that students are really in charge of their own learning. They need to be assessment capable. Something that my principal always says is, what a student's doing all year long in class is what they'll be able to do on the test. Like the big SBAC test that happens at the end of the year. Really, if they're doing it all year long, they're going to be successful on the test. But if you do nothing that fits those requirements all year long, you can't just expect them to do really well on the test, because they haven't had the practice that they need to do that. Rubrics are really helpful when it comes to assessments, because for us teachers, when grading, we know specifically what we're looking for, but also for the students, if they're provided to them before they complete the project or before they complete the assignment of any type, they know what's being expected of them. So it's almost like there's no surprises. You know, they know what they're doing, they know what's expected of them, and then they know if their final what they turn into, basically their completed assignment, fits that criteria or not. So, and then in chapter 6 was one that I really liked a lot, because it's something I struggle with, but it's knowing when to differentiate instruction and how to do it. I think when people think of differentiating something, they think of just completely changing it or making it different. That's what the differentiation part of it is. But really, it is still fitting the learning target, still fitting the standard, still, you know, goes along the same lines as your assessment. It's just doing it in a different way, or doing it in, you know, smaller segments to make a student more successful. So something that I liked a lot in chapter 6 was they talked about these two teachers who at one point I fit right in with Miss Jones, but Miss Jones thought that differentiating it was really just giving them a bunch of different options they can choose from. And so the students were given all these different options, but only like the one true option fit what the actual learning target was, or fit what was expected of them to meet the standard. So she gave all these options, but one of them I believe was like dressing up. Well, dressing up is fun and it's engaging and it might get students excited to do it, but whether or not they can dress up appropriately, it had nothing to do with the learning target. So then on the flip side of that, Mr. Smith, he also gave lots of options for his students to complete a project, but all of them still fit the learning target and fit the needs to meet that standard. So I feel like if you always make sure that your learning target is the focus of what you're having your students do, then it is an appropriate differentiation. Another part of that too, sorry, just before I move on, is fluff assignments. And I thought that this was a good part of it too, because a lot of teachers will give students, they think if students are working, like students are learning kind of thing. Like, if he's sitting there quietly and he's working on his worksheet, then obviously we're doing good things, you know? And that's not always the case, because you could give, adding and subtracting fractions all day long, but if that doesn't fit what your learning target is, or fit the need to meet the standard, or even go along the same lines of what standard you are wanting them to accomplish, then it's not useful, you know. So always making sure that your assignments fit the learning target. So the learning target focus for sure. And then kind of the last couple things was project-based learning. We as a district have really gotten into kind of making sure that students are thinking, they're talking, and they're writing. And I made the connection between the project-based learning chapter that we read about, because when we have our students thinking alone, it's great because some of them have some really good thoughts, but for those who don't, automatically make that connection, hearing it come from another student or hearing it come in a different way is beneficial to them. So something I will have my students do is to answer a question, usually the ones where they ask them to explain something or justify why they've gotten their answer, or the reasoning behind the method that they chose to solve the answer if it's math, is I'll have them, not even address the question quite yet, like solving the question, but just thinking about how they're going to approach it, why they're going to approach it that way, and then just kind of go through the steps. So they'll think for a little bit, and then they'll turn to either their partner or with their group, and they'll discuss their thoughts that they were just thinking about. And then after they've had a discussion, they'll write down their answer for me. And what I see is during that talking time, it's encouraging them, and it's kind of activating some prior knowledge, or just any knowledge they didn't necessarily know that they had or think about when they had their alone think time. But then once it was said, it was kind of like, oh yeah, and they can piggyback off of each other. So that's something we really like, especially since a lot of those Common Core standards ask the students to, if everything's an and why, or explain why or justify why. It's not so, once you know the answer, you're good to go. You need to explain how you got the answer, why that's the answer. So that kind of summed up most of what we've read in the Learning Targets book. Last week we had a unit study, which I liked a lot, because it, as much as, day by day, I'm incorporating learning targets or our objectives or things like that, it was kind of one of the first times that I've written down and decided, like, this is a standard I wanted to cover, this is what my learning target would be, and this is how I would do it. Because my unit study I didn't actually do. I do teach rates and ratio, but not in that exact specific way that I had written down. And it just kind of shows that once you do break that standard apart and you have a learning target for it, it makes designing the activities or the formative assessments and summative assessments you do so much easier once that learning target's in place. So that basically covers everything we've learned so far. I really liked the Learning Target book. I thought that it was a great book to have for this course. And yeah, that was about it.
Cool.